Beyond Politics and Rhetoric, How Lucas Mangope, Cedric Patudi, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi co-governed with Afrikaners to build stability, prosperity and peace. One of the greatest failures of the African National Congress, ANC, in its rise to power was its childish and reckless approach to experienced African leaders who had governed under the Bantustan system. Instead of recognizing these leaders as assets with practical governance experience, the ANC denounced, humiliated, and actively worked to erase their contributions. The party's obsession with revolutionary purity blinded it to the reality that governance is about competence, not slogans. In the ANC's version of history, any black leader who held office before 1994 must have been a puppet. They did not care if these men built schools, maintained order, developed economies, and ensured food security. They simply labelled them Bantustan leaders and expected the public to boo and hiss. But let's break this down logically. The ANC tells us that Lucas Mangope was a useless puppet. Yet, under his rule, Bophuthatswana had one of the most functional economies in southern Africa. The ANC tells us that Cedric Patudi was irrelevant. Yet, under his leadership, Leboa had a disciplined administration and a focus on education. The ANC tells us that Mangosuthu, Buthelezi, was a stooge. Yet he was one of the few black leaders who negotiated, governed effectively, and kept his province from falling into chaos. The ANC's ability to twist language for political gain is both tragic and hilarious. Take the term Bantustan leader. If we strip away all the emotional manipulation, what does it actually mean? Bantu means black people of South Africa. Stan is a suffix meaning land or region, like Pakistan or Uzbekistan. Leader means someone in charge. So, Bantustan leader literally means a black leader governing a region. Yet, thanks to ANC propaganda, this term is now treated as an insult, a smear, a way to delegitimize real black leaders who held power before 1994. How ridiculous is that? Think about it. They turned the phrase black leader into an insult. The irony is that while the ANC celebrated its victory and handed out positions to its loyal cadres, many of whom had no experience in administration, South Africa began to crumble. Those who had once governed regions, handled economic planning, and built administrative structures were sidelined or destroyed. The result? A government driven by self-interest, looting, and incompetence, rather than the hard realities of managing a country. Buthelezi warned of this. He knew that governance required more than just the thrill of political victory. It required skill, patience, and wisdom. He understood that the reckless purge of experienced African leaders would lead to disaster. And he was right. Today, South Africa bears the scars of the ANC's arrogance, with collapsing institutions, mismanaged resources, and a political class more focused on personal enrichment than national progress. I spent considerable time crafting and fine-tuning the title of this book. The initial title for this book was The Strategy of Engagement, How Mangope, Buthelezi, and Patudi worked within the Afrikaner government to influence change. However, the title, after deliberations and engagement with some circle of scholars and researchers, the title finally what it is now, Beyond Politics and Rhetoric, How Mangope, Patudi, and Buthelezi co-governed with Afrikaners to build stability, prosperity and peace. The ANC loves to mock Bantustan leaders, but let's compare. So, tell me, who are the real failures? The ANC does not deserve to mock anyone. They took over a functioning country and turned it into a disaster. How desperate must you be to take the phrase black leader and turn it into an insult? Only a party as insecure and incompetent as the ANC could make. Governance look bad. Functioning infrastructure looks suspicious. Black leadership before 1994 look illegitimate. All so that they could cover up the fact that they have failed to run the country for 30 years. They have convinced South Africans that order, discipline and functional governance were bad things, and that their own brand of chaos, corruption and destruction is what real liberation looks like. The verdict: stop falling for the ANC's lies. It is time for South Africans to wake up and reclaim their history. A Bantustan leader was just a black leader who governed. The ANC has done worse than any Bantustan leader ever did. The real insult is how the ANC has destroyed the country while pretending to be superior. So the next time someone sneers Bantustan leader as an insult, laugh in their face. Tell them, at least Bantustan leaders governed. What has the ANC done? End? So how do we begin? Lucas Mangope, Cedric Fatudi, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Who are these people? These are people you were taught to be Bantustans and puppets of apartheid. But what is the reality above what you were taught? Rather than waging a senseless war of antagonism, these leaders co-governed with the Afrikaners in a way that ensured stability, economic development, and peace. This was not about submission. It was about strategy. They secured resources for their people through intelligent negotiations. They ensured small-scale farming thrived so that there was no mass hunger. They maintained peace so that their regions were not swallowed by chaos and crime. Compare this to what we see today: hunger, joblessness, crime, and state collapse. Who really had the better leadership approach? One of the greatest betrayals of modern South Africa is the collapse of agriculture and food security. But under Mangope, Fatudi, and Buthelezi, black communities were not starving. They invested in small-scale farming, ensuring that people could produce their own food. They built irrigation systems and cooperatives, making local food production efficient. They worked with Afrikaner commercial farmers, creating a system where food was affordable and available to everyone. Today, millions of South Africans go to bed hungry. Food prices are skyrocketing. Rural farmers are ignored or struggling, though the ANC took power promising economic empowerment. Yet they have done nothing to ensure that black South Africans can feed themselves. The small-scale agricultural success of Mangope, Fatudi, and Buthelezi was abandoned in favour of corruption and short-term greed. A time of stability and order, not the darkness we see. Now under these men's leadership, their regions were stable, orderly, and safe. Law enforcement worked. Communities functioned. There was no widespread looting, hijackings, or lawlessness. Police officers did their jobs instead of working for crime syndicates. Infrastructure was maintained, not left to decay. Public services were delivered efficiently and without corruption. Compare that to today. Crime is out of control. infrastructure is collapsing. Public services barely function. The reality is simple. These men governed in a way that ensured peace and stability, something the ANC has completely failed to do. Decades later, history is forcing us to re-evaluate their legacy. South Africa was not supposed to collapse into corruption, crime, and economic ruin. It was supposed to thrive under capable black leadership. Leadership that these men demonstrated long before 1994. They knew that leadership is about deliberate thought, wisdom, and long-term vision, not reckless revolution. They walked a difficult path, balancing three crucial responsibilities: preserving African traditions, advancing the struggle for self-determination, and engaging the Afrikaner government with a strategic mind rather than empty hostility. This is not about nostalgia. This is about reclaiming the truth. Because if South Africans do not recognize what real black leadership once looked like, they will continue settling for the looters, liars, and opportunists who masquerade as leaders today, who really worked for the people. The ANC loves to act as if it was the sole liberator of black people. But where is the liberation? Are people safer today than under Mangope, Fatudi, and Buthelezi? No. Are people wealthier today than under their rule? No. Do people have more food security today? No. Do people have more peace and stability today? No. The truth is, these leaders ran their regions better than the ANC has run South Africa. And if we remove the political propaganda, what do we see? A working system that provided stability, prosperity, and dignity. Politics is full of slogans, empty promises, and ideological posturing, but real leadership is about results. If we strip away all the political nonsense and rhetoric, one thing becomes clear. Lucas Mangope, Cedric Fatudi, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi were not caught up in petty political battles. They rose above divisive distractions and focused on governing, on ensuring that their people had food, stability, and opportunity. Unlike the leaders we see today, who only care about enriching themselves, these men had a singular focus: the well-being of the people. They understood that governance is not about grandstanding. It is about delivering real, tangible improvements to daily life. And in this, they succeeded far more than the ANC ever has. But after 30 years of ANC rule, the very image of black leadership has been permanently stained, tainted, and dragged through the mud. Today, when South Africans think of a black leader, what comes to mind? A corrupt politician, a thief who loots public funds, a man obsessed with flashy cars and designer suits, a sugar man with a harem of slay queens, a selfish opportunist who doesn't care about the people. Buthelezi versus the ANC, a clash of governance. And maturity Mangosuthu Buthelezi's early clashes with the ANC were not merely political rivalries, but fundamental disagreements over governance, vision, and the maturity required to build a stable nation. While the ANC was driven by fiery slogans, revolutionary zeal, and a deep-seated anger towards the Afrikaner government, Buthelezi approached leadership with a far more strategic and pragmatic mindset. He understood that governance was not about rhetoric but about careful planning, compromise, and long-term vision. From the onset, Buthelezi positioned himself not as an agitator but as a statesman. He saw the need for a transition that would not lead to chaos but to a structured, well-managed future. Unlike the ANC leadership, who were exiled and disconnected from the realities of governing a country, Buthelezi had first-hand experience in administration. As the leader of the KwaZulu government under the Homeland System, he operated within the political structures of the time, not as a puppet, but as a tactician who knew that engagement was necessary to ensure African self-determination. The ANC's refusal to recognize his insights led to sharp divisions. Buthelezi called for negotiations that would prevent a bloodbath, insisting that South Africa's future could not be built on anger alone. He warned that slogans and revolutionary songs would not put food on the table, build infrastructure, or ensure economic growth. Instead, he emphasized the need for wisdom, patience, and an understanding of realpolitik, concepts that the ANC, in its emotional fervor, dismissed as weakness or even betrayal. But history has proven Buthelezi right. The ANC's eventual rise to power was marked by the very recklessness he had cautioned against. Decades later, the consequences of immature governance are clear. Collapsing infrastructure, economic stagnation, and a political culture rooted in populism rather than competence. The dream of a prosperous South Africa, once within reach, was squandered by those who mistook fiery rhetoric for effective leadership. This is the tragic legacy of ANC rule. Black leadership, which once had respect, honor, and admiration, is now synonymous with crime, greed, and failure. The ANC has betrayed the next generation of black leaders. Black South Africans today should have strong, disciplined, visionary leaders to look up to. Instead, they have ministers who steal billions from Eskom and leave the country in darkness. Mayors who bankrupt cities and still get re-elected. MPs who spend more time drinking champagne than fixing the economy. Leaders who reward criminals while punishing whistleblowers. Instead of teaching young black leaders about discipline, service, and nation-building, the ANC has taught them that leadership is just about stealing as much as possible before getting caught. This is the ANC's real crime, not just corruption, but the complete destruction of black leadership. In hindsight, the ANC is the biggest enemy of black people. For decades, the ANC positioned itself as the champion of black South Africans, the party that liberated the people from apartheid and ushered in democracy. But with 30 years of ANC rule behind us, the evidence is now undeniable. The ANC has become the single biggest enemy of black South Africans. While they preached freedom, equality, and prosperity, the ANC has instead delivered only suffering, economic collapse, and broken dreams. Today, black South Africans are worse off than ever, not because of apartheid, not because of Afrikaners, but because of the very party that promised to uplift them. The ANC's betrayal of black South Africans. Let's break down what 30 years of ANC rule has actually given to the very people they claim to fight for. Highest unemployment in South African history. Millions of black South Africans remain jobless, especially the youth. Under apartheid, employment in mines, factories, and government jobs provided at least a minimal livelihood. Under the ANC, entire industries have collapsed, leaving a country where the rich get richer and the poor sink deeper into suffering. Collapsing infrastructure. A return to the Dark Ages, Eskom's failure has plunged black communities into endless load shedding, making economic survival impossible. Hospitals and schools are falling apart, leaving black South Africans with no quality healthcare or education. Roads in black townships and rural areas are either crumbling or completely non-existent. Under apartheid, these areas were at least developed, albeit unequally. 3. The destruction of black entrepreneurship. The ANC has made it nearly impossible for black South Africans to succeed economically. Instead of creating an enabling environment for black business, the ANC has focused on corruption and tender fraud, enriching only a small elite. The dream of black economic independence has been hijacked by ANC looters who take government contracts but deliver nothing in return. Crime and lawlessness. No protection for the black majority. Black-on-black crime has skyrocketed, with no intervention from the government. The police force is either incompetent, corrupt, or both, leaving poor communities to fend for themselves. ANC politicians live in high-security mansions, while the average black South African lives in constant fear of murder, robbery, and rape. The collapse of black education schools in rural areas and townships have become war zones, with children learning in overcrowded, unsafe classrooms. The ANC's education system is a complete failure, ensuring that the next generation of black youth has no future. Under apartheid, education was unequal, but it existed. Under the ANC, it has been destroyed. Political corruption. Looting black South Africa into poverty. The ANC has stolen billions from the people, ensuring that only politicians and their friends benefit from South Africa's wealth. Black South Africans were promised land and economic freedom. Instead, they got politicians buying luxury cars, drinking champagne, and wearing designer clothes while their own people starve. Instead of uplifting the black majority, the ANC has only enriched itself. Compare the ANC's rule to the Afrikaner government. For all its faults, even the apartheid-era government provided basic services. Roads were built and maintained. Power stations functioned. The police enforced law and order. State-owned enterprises actually worked. Government officials were disciplined and competent. Now, after 30 years of ANC rule, the state is in total collapse. Would any honest person argue that black South Africans are better off today than they were before? The real betrayal is that the ANC had the opportunity to fix the injustices of apartheid and create a thriving modern country for all. Instead, they burned everything down and blamed apartheid for their own failures. The ANC needs black South Africans to stay poor. Why? Has the ANC done this? Because a poor, uneducated black majority is easy to control. If people have jobs, they don't need handouts. If people are educated, they ask difficult questions. If people are independent, they no longer fear politicians. The ANC knows this. Keeping the black majority poor and dependent on government handouts ensures that they always have voters. It is not about uplifting black people, it is about maintaining political power. This is why the ANC destroys black businesses, but allows foreign nationals to operate freely. The ANC lets crime spiral out of control, so people are too afraid to challenge the government. The ANC fails to fix schools because educated people might stop voting for them. It is a deliberate strategy. Keep the people desperate, so they will always believe that the ANC is their only hope. The ANC is the true oppressor in hindsight. The greatest enemy of black South Africans is not apartheid, not Afrikaners, not Bantustan leaders. It is the ANC. They have ruined every state-owned enterprise that once provided black employment. They have destroyed the education system that could have uplifted the next generation. They have stolen money meant for the poor, leaving black communities in deeper suffering. They have allowed crime and lawlessness to flourish, ensuring that black people live in constant fear. They have used propaganda to make black South Africans believe that they have no other choice but the ANC. But the truth is this: the ANC does not love black people. It exploits them. It uses them. And when it no longer needs them, it discards them. It is time for black South Africans to wake up and see the ANC for what it truly is: a parasitic organisation that has done more damage to black lives than even apartheid did. The greatest enemy of black South Africans is not the past. It is the corrupt rulers of the present. And unless the people take a stand, reject the ANC, and demand better leadership, the suffering will continue for generations to come. South Africa's real liberation will not come from the ANC. It will come the day South Africans finally reject them. Leadership is not about blind resistance or emotional outbursts. It is about strategy, patience, and knowing when to engage rather than antagonize. Lucas Mangope, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, and Cedric Fatudi understood this better than anyone. While others demanded immediate revolution, these men wormed their way into the corridors of power, not as submissive puppets, but as strategic thinkers who used their access to push for real change from within. They understood a crucial truth. The Afrikaner government was not a single, unmovable entity. It was a system led by men who, over time, were evolving in their thinking. And instead of shutting the door on dialogue, Mangope, Buthelezi, and Fatudi kept the conversation going, using their positions to offer an African perspective that slowly chipped away at rigid apartheid ideologies. How did they do it? They engaged Afrikaner leadership, not alienated. E.T., instead of adopting a posture of absolute hostility, they sat at the table with Afrikaner officials, forcing them to confront the realities of black governance. Through practical administration, they demonstrated that black leadership was not only possible, but often more competent than apartheid officials had been led to believe. They provided a working alternative to the ANC's chaos. While the ANC was in exile, making demands through fiery speeches, these leaders were on the ground, running governments, managing budgets, and proving that black self-rule was viable. J embodied a practical transition model, one that was far more stable than the eventual ANC takeover. They shifted hardline Afrikaner minds by offering perspective. Afrikaner leadership was deeply entrenched in old-world fears of black rule, but by governing effectively, showing discipline, and refusing to allow chaos under their watch, Mangope, Buthelezi, and Fatudi planted seeds of doubt in the minds of apartheid's hardest defenders. Over time, these engagements led to a quiet revolution within Afrikaner political circles. P.W. Botha was already considering reforms. F.W. de Klerk eventually dismantled apartheid. Roelf Meyer and other National Party figures saw that peaceful transition was inevitable. None of this would have happened without strategic black leaders operating within the system, proving that dialogue was a far more powerful weapon than blind hostility. The ANC's fatal mistake. The ANC, on the other hand, dismissed this strategy as weakness. They vilified these men, calling them sellouts, instead of recognizing them as pioneers of peaceful engagement. What was the result? The ANC inherited a broken country, not a prepared one. They took over without a functioning transition model. They replaced strategic leadership with corrupt populism. Had they worked with leaders like Mangope, Buthelezi, and Fatudi instead of vilifying them, South Africa's transition could have been far smoother, more stable, and more economically successful. Conclusion. The strategy that worked history now forces us to ask, who was right? Those who shouted from exile but built nothing? Or those who worked from within, influenced minds, and prepared the groundwork for real black governance? The ANC may have won the political battle, but it is clear that Mangope, Buthelezi, and Fatudi had the better strategy. They understood that to defeat an enemy, you must first get into the room where decisions are made. And they did. They didn't just resist. They changed minds, influenced policies, and laid the foundation for what could have been a successful, black-led South Africa. The tragedy is that their vision was ignored. And now, South Africa pays the price. Mangosuthu Buthelezi was more than just a politician. He was a towering figure in South Africa's political landscape, a leader whose legacy is deeply interwoven with Zulu identity, tradition, and the evolution of the nation itself. Over the course of more than 7 decades, Buthelezi navigated the complex interplay between power, cultural heritage, and political strategy, cementing his place as one of the most enduring and influential figures in South African history. Born into Zulu royalty in 1928, Buthelezi inherited not only a legacy of leadership, but also the responsibility of preserving and advancing his people's interests. As the founder and longtime leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party, IFP, he played a defining role in South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy. His political career was marked by both controversy and pragmatism, hailed by some as a champion of Zulu nationalism and by others as a leader whose alliances and decisions sparked fierce debate. In this audiobook, we explore the intricate journey of Mangosuthu Buthelezi's leadership, his early influences, the founding of Inkatha, his complex relationship with Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, ANC, and his role in shaping South Africa's democratic era. We examine his ability to balance tradition and modern governance, his longevity in politics, and the strategic decisions that allowed him to remain relevant across multiple political eras. This is the story of a man who stood at the crossroads of history, a leader who blended political acumen with cultural pride, and whose legacy continues to shape the discourse on identity, governance, and power in South Africa. The ANC's naivete and the wasted wisdom of Bantustan leaders. One of the greatest failures of the African National Congress, ANC, in its rise to power was its childish and reckless approach to experienced African leaders who had governed under the Bantustan system. Instead of recognizing these leaders as assets with practical governance experience, the ANC denounced, humiliated, and actively worked to erase their contributions. The party's obsession with revolutionary purity blinded it to the reality that governance is about competence, not slogans. Mangosuthu Buthelezi stood as the prime example of a leader who understood the complexity of statecraft. He was not alone. Many Bantustan leaders had built administrative structures, managed budgets, and run governmental institutions under difficult circumstances. They were not perfect, but they had knowledge that could have been invaluable in transitioning South Africa into a functional democracy. Yet the ANC, drunk on its own sense of moral superiority, saw these leaders as obstacles rather than resources. Instead of transitioning them into the new system and tapping into their governance expertise, the ANC waged a vicious campaign against them, portraying them as illegitimate stooges of the Afrikaner government. This was not about justice or principles. It was about eliminating competition. The ANC did not want competent African leaders with independent power bases. It wanted total control, and it was willing to manipulate the masses, fueling anger and division to achieve it. The irony is that while the ANC celebrated its victory and handed out positions to its loyal cadres, many of whom had no experience in administration, South Africa began to crumble. Those who had once governed regions, handled economic planning, and built administrative structures were sidelined or destroyed. The result? A government driven by self-interest, looting, and incompetence rather than the hard realities of managing a country. Buthelezi warned of this. He knew that governance required more than just the thrill of political victory. It required skill, patience, and wisdom. He understood that the reckless purge of experienced African leaders would lead to disaster, and he was right. Today, South Africa bears the scars of the ANC's arrogance. With collapsing institutions, mismanaged resources, and a political class more focused on personal enrichment than national progress. This chapter examines how the ANC's betrayal of its own people was not just in its corruption, but in its refusal to build on the knowledge and experience of those who had already laid governance foundations. Had it embraced, rather than vilified, the likes of Buthelezi and others, South Africa's story might have been one of success rather than decline. What works works, a lesson the ANC refuses to learn. Governance is not about ideology, rhetoric, or emotional grandstanding. It is about what works. Yet, even today, the African National Congress, ANC, fails to grasp this fundamental lesson. Instead of focusing on practical solutions, economic stability, and geopolitical strategy, the ANC continues to make decisions that defy logic and undermine the country's long-term well-being. A perfect example of this ignorance is South Africa's misguided loyalty to economically weak Russia while creating unnecessary hostilities with the West. This is political naivety at its worst. South Africa is deeply Western in its economy, trade, and legal systems. Yet the ANC leadership, blinded by outdated liberation-era sentiments, chooses to align with a declining power, while alienating the very nations that sustain its economy. This is not strategy. It is stupidity masquerading as principle. Contrast this with the simple yet effective governance of the Bantustan administrations. While these governments operated within the constraints of apartheid South Africa, they at least ensured stability, maintained administrative order, and kept basic functions running. Leaders like Mangosuthu Buthelezi understood that governance was about delivering results, not ideological posturing. Under their rule, there was relative peace, functioning local economies, and leadership that, despite its limitations, did not devolve into the chaos we see today. Fast forward to ANC rule, and South Africa is unrecognizable. The country is now run by armed criminals who enforce corruption through violence and assassinations. Speaking out against corruption has become a death sentence. Activists, whistleblowers, and honest officials are silenced one by one. The brutal killings of Babita Deokaran, Ralph Kanyane, and many others are clear evidence of a state that no longer serves the people, but is controlled by mafia-like syndicates embedded in government. Instead of ensuring law and order, the ANC has allowed gangsterism to flourish within its own ranks. Those who dare to expose corruption are eliminated, and justice is rarely served. This is not governance. It is state capture at its most brutal. The Bantustan leaders, for all their criticisms, at least kept governance functional and corruption controlled. The ANC, by contrast, has no vision beyond looting and self-enrichment. It refuses to learn from history, refuses to recognize what works, and continues to drive the country toward economic collapse and social unrest. Leadership is about results, not slogans. But as long as the ANC remains in power, South Africa will continue to suffer from the consequences of their reckless incompetence. The mature leadership of Buthelezi, the lost opportunity for South Africa. Mature leadership is what South Africa desperately needs today, yet it is exactly what was ignored when it mattered most. Mangosuthu Buthelezi was a statesman who understood governance beyond slogans, emotions, and revolution. Had his wisdom been embraced in the early days of transition, when ANC rhetoric was at its loudest and most reckless, the country would not be in the crisis it faces today. Instead, the ANC chose to drown out Buthelezi's voice, dismissing his calls for caution, structured governance, and economic realism as backward or counter-revolutionary. They mistook his insistence on negotiation and stability for weakness. In their rush to claim power, they rejected the very leadership qualities that could have prevented South Africa's current decline. The consequences of this immaturity are now impossible to ignore. The highest crime rate in South Africa's history. Criminal syndicates operate with impunity. Police are either overwhelmed or corrupt, and ordinary citizens live in fear. The highest inequality in the world. The rich get richer, while the poor are plunged deeper into poverty. Economic mismanagement and corruption have widened the gap to breaking point. The highest youth unemployment rate. A generation of young people has been robbed of opportunity due to failed policies, lack of investment, and an education system that does not prepare them for the workforce. The collapse of state institutions. Once world-class entities like Denel, Eskom, Transnet, SAA, and the railway network have been looted into dysfunction. These institutions were not just businesses. They were the backbone of South Africa's economic infrastructure. Their failure is a national catastrophe, the decline of the police force. Instead of maintaining law and order, the police have become either ineffective or complicit in crime. The very institution meant to protect citizens has been hollowed out by corruption and incompetence. The erosion of financial governance. Institutions like the Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA, once symbols of economic strength, are now plagued by mismanagement and inefficiency. Buthelezi saw these dangers long before they materialized. He understood that a nation could not be built on radicalism and anger alone. His calls for a balanced, pragmatic approach to governance, where economic growth, security, and cultural preservation coexisted, were ignored in favor of a reckless pursuit of power and personal gain by ANC elites. Today, South Africa is paying the price for that arrogance. The maturity, discipline, and leadership that Buthelezi embodied could have set the country on a completely different path. Instead, short-sighted decisions have left the nation in ruin. As the country stands at a crossroads, there is only one question left. Will South Africa finally learn from its past mistakes and seek leadership that prioritizes governance over politics, or will it continue down the path of destruction? The answer will determine the fate of generations to come. The wisdom that could have saved South Africa. The story of South Africa's decline is not one of inevitable fate. It is a consequence of leadership failure, short-sighted governance, and a refusal to learn from those who understood the complexities of running a nation. At the heart of this missed opportunity stands Mangosuthu Buthelezi, a leader whose strategic foresight, deep cultural grounding, and commitment to pragmatic governance were ignored at a time when South Africa needed them most. From the beginning, Buthelezi recognized that governance is not about fiery rhetoric or ideological purity. It is about managing a country with wisdom, discipline, and foresight. He understood that engagement with the Afrikaner government was not about surrender, but about securing the best possible position for African leadership in the transition to a new South Africa. While the ANC indulged in revolutionary slogans and emotional politics, Buthelezi focused on what truly mattered: stability, economic sustainability, and the preservation of African traditions beyond mere political gestures. His early clashes with the ANC were not about opposition for its own sake, but about a fundamental difference in approach. Buthelezi called for patience, negotiation, and the steady transition of experienced African leaders into the new democratic order. The ANC, blinded by its revolutionary fervour, refused to listen. Instead of seeing Bantustan leaders as administrators who could provide continuity and expertise, the ANC vilified them, turning the masses against them in a vicious campaign of destruction. The result was a government filled with inexperienced, self-interested politicians who saw governance as a personal prize rather than a responsibility. Buthelezi's warnings were dismissed, and the consequences of that rejection have played out over the decades in ways that can no longer be ignored. The loss of law and order, crime syndicates, political assassinations, and the rise of gunmen who enforce corruption have turned South Africa into a nation where whistleblowers like Babita, Deokaran, and Ralph Kanyane are silenced permanently. The police, once a force for national security, have become either compromised or overwhelmed. Economic collapse and state dysfunction. The ANC's failure to recognize what works has led to the destruction of key institutions. Instead of safeguarding economic assets and infrastructure, the party has looted and mismanaged Denel, Eskom, Transnet, SAA, and the railway network, ensuring that essential services are either crumbling or non-existent. Youth unemployment and worsening inequality, the gap between rich and poor has never been wider, and the next generation is left without hope. The ANC's policies have failed to create sustainable jobs, while corruption has siphoned resources meant for development. Political isolation and diplomatic recklessness. Instead of strengthening ties with economic powerhouses, South Africa has alienated its key Western partners while cozying up to a financially weakened Russia. This is not strategy. It is self-destruction fueled by outdated ideological nostalgia. Had Buthelezi been heeded, South Africa's trajectory would have been entirely different. His vision of governance was one where African traditions were integrated into modern statecraft, where stability was prioritized over political grandstanding, and where governance was built on competence rather than entitlement. Instead, South Africa finds itself at a breaking point, betrayed by the very party that once promised liberation. The question now is not whether Buthelezi was right. History has already answered that. The question is whether South Africa will finally learn from the wisdom it once rejected or continue its descent into chaos. As the nation stands on the brink, one truth remains undeniable. What works, works. Until leadership embraces this simple reality, South Africa will remain trapped in a cycle of failure, watching its potential slip away, just as Buthelezi once warned. Leadership, family, and the integrity of Buthelezi. In an era where many young leaders equate power with luxury, Mangosuthu, Buthelezi stood as a stark contrast. When he was young, well-educated, and came from a position of nobility, he did not waste his life flaunting wealth, chasing flashy cars, or surrounding himself with women seeking status and money, what today's culture calls slay queens. Instead, Buthelezi was a man of discipline, focused on nation-building even within the strict confines of the Afrikaner government. Unlike many of today's politicians who prioritize self-indulgence over service, Buthelezi understood that leadership was about responsibility, not personal gratification. He did not use his position to indulge in excess. He carried himself with dignity, demonstrating what it meant to be a true statesman. He was a family man, deeply rooted in traditional values, and upheld the idea that a leader should first and foremost be accountable to those closest to him, his family, his people, and his nation. This personal integrity made him a stabilizing figure. Young men could look to Buthelezi and see a leader who was serious, grounded, and committed to something greater than himself. He did not confuse governance with entertainment, nor did he reduce politics to a platform for flaunting wealth. His commitment to family values was more than just personal. It was a moral compass that guided his leadership, ensuring that he did not fall into the traps of arrogance, corruption, or reckless living. Contrast this with today's political culture, where many so-called leaders have abandoned the principles of service and replaced them with self-indulgence. They drive around in flashy luxury cars, flaunt expensive lifestyles, and surround themselves with superficial status symbols, instead of focusing on governance. There was a time when leadership in the Northwest Province meant building, developing, and securing the future. A time when governance was about roads, schools, hospitals, financial stability, and community progress, not corruption, looting, and economic decay. That time was under the leadership of Lucas Mangope, a man who laid down the foundations of a thriving region before the ANC turned it into the crumbling mess it is today. Mangope was no ordinary leader. He was a man of action, a planner, a builder, and a statesman. While many talk about leadership, he demonstrated it. He built not just physical infrastructure, but social cohesion, ensuring that his people had access to quality education, financial support, and an administration that functioned efficiently. Today, under 30 years of ANC misrule, the Northwest Province has become unrecognizable, a place where roads are filled with potholes, schools are underfunded, hospitals are failing, crime is out of control. Corruption is a daily reality, and the social fabric of the province is deteriorating. Lucas Mangope's governance was far from perfect, but it was grounded in a clear, structured vision, one that emphasized progress, stability, and service delivery. This book will explore his achievements, his leadership style, and how his era of governance compares to the disastrous ANC rule that followed. Let's begin by looking at what real leadership looked like under Mangope, and how the Northwest Province is now suffering under a government that only knows how to take, but never how to build. Building a province. The Mangope legacy. Lucas Mangope understood something that today's leaders have forgotten. Governance is about results, not slogans. Under his leadership, the Northwest Province saw some of the most efficient development projects in the country. Roads and Infrastructure Mangope prioritized infrastructure development, building roads that connected communities, allowing trade and economic activity to thrive. Today, under ANC rule, those same roads have disintegrated into pothole-ridden death traps. Education and institution education was a cornerstone of Mangope's vision. Schools were built and properly maintained. Medialia, an educational institution that uplifted many, was part of his drive to ensure the youth had a strong foundation for the future, financial stability and community funding. Unlike the ANC, which has bankrupted the province through corruption and looting, Mangope ensured that public finances were managed responsibly. Community financing programs helped small businesses and ensured economic participation at a grassroots level. Social cohesion and stability Mangope fostered unity and cooperation among different groups, preventing the kind of lawlessness and political violence that has now become common under ANC rule. Chapter 2. The Northwest under ANC, from model province to disaster. Since the ANC took control, the Northwest Province has been turned into a political and economic wasteland. The once thriving region now suffers from corruption and mismanagement. Public funds meant for development are stolen by ANC officials, leaving hospitals without medicine, schools without books, and roads in total collapse. Collapse of basic statut. Services under Mangope, electricity, water and sanitation functioned properly. Today, residents endure constant blackouts, water shortages and failing infrastructure because the ANC has no interest in governance, only in looting. Crime and lawlessness. Mangope's government kept law and order intact. Today, criminals rule the streets, hijacking, robbing and murdering without consequence. The ANC has allowed the province to descend into chaos, where police are either corrupt or too afraid to act. Chapter 3. Leadership versus lootership. The difference between Mangope and the ANC leadership is about building and safeguarding a future. Under Mangope, roads were built and maintained. Education was prioritized, public funds were well managed, communities were supported financially, law and order were upheld. Under the ANC, roads have collapsed, schools are failing, public funds are looted, community programs have disappeared, crime is out of control. The contrast is undeniable. Where Mangope's leadership was about development, planning and accountability, the ANC's rule is about personal enrichment, destruction and incompetence. The ANC's strategy: destroy black heritage, replace it with corrupt career politicians. The ANC's rejection of traditional African leadership is not accidental. It is a deliberate political strategy. Why? Because traditional leaders answer to their people, not to political parties. A chief or a traditional leader is accountable to his community, his history, and his ancestors. An ANC politician is accountable only to the party, their faction, and their corruption network. By undermining traditional leadership, the ANC ensures that all power is centralized in the hands of party officials. There is no independent African authority structure to challenge them. Black people become disconnected from their heritage and history, making them easier to manipulate. This is why traditional leaders who govern well are ignored, but corrupt ANC mayors and premiers are promoted. The ANC does not want strong blacks' leadership. It wants weak, corrupt, the ANC's provinces, a rebranded Bantustan system built for corruption. The ANC has spent 30 years mocking the Bantustans, calling them illegitimate, unworkable and oppressive. Yet, in an irony so glaring, it would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic. The ANC has copied the exact same Bantustan template and simply rebranded it as provinces. If the Bantustans were a fraudulent, fragmented system designed to keep black people divided, then what exactly are South Africa's current ANC-run provinces, where corruption is rampant, service delivery is non-existent, and every premier runs their territory like a personal fiefdom? The only real difference between Bantustans and ANC provinces is this: Bantustans had order, provinces have chaos. Bantustans had infrastructure, provinces have decay. Bantustan leaders built functional administrations. ANC premiers destroy everything they touch. So, what exactly did the ANC change? Besides making everything worse, the ANC took the Bantustan system and made it even more dysfunctional. If the ANC truly hated the Bantustan system, why did they replicate its structure? Under apartheid, the Bantustans were semi-autonomous territories. Under ANC rule, provinces function the exact same way, except now they are controlled by corrupt premiers. Let's compare. If the ANC really wanted to create a better system, why did they copy the old one but remove the functionality? The Bantustans had infrastructure. ANC provinces have ruins. The ANC claims Bantustans were a failure, yet they were able to build and maintain roads, schools and hospitals. Today, under ANC rule, potholes dominate every road. Hospitals are collapsing. Police are corrupt and ineffective. Basic services like water and electricity are unreliable.